Hello sweeties, hope you're having a good week so far. Welcome to this week's Inspirational Women from History. Today I'll be talking about the Gothic legend that is Mary Shelley. Born in 1797, she's best known as the author of the classic novel Frankenstein. She was the daughter of feminist Mary Wollstonecraft and philosopher William Godwin. And her upbringing was an unusual one compared to many at the time and even now. Her mother died within days of Mary's birth, leaving her alone with her father and half-sister. She was encouraged to follow her father's beliefs and tenets of free love and such, and he used texts written by her mother for her main education. She also learned to write by tracing the letters on her mother's grave. A while later, her father remarried to another Mary, and Mary Shelley found herself feeling unwanted and unloved. Her stepmother felt she was in competition with Mary when it came to the attention of William, especially as Mary grew and began to look more and more like her mother. Her increased resemblance to her dead mother caused her father to become distant, which hurt Mary greatly because previously they'd been really close. Her stepmother decided that the best thing to do was to send Mary away to boarding school. The excuse given was that Mary was ill, her health wasn't great, so sending her to a school in Dundee, Scotland would be better than her staying in London. However, this caused her to grow more distant from her father, and it caused a lot of resentment towards her stepmother. She met Percy Shelley when she was 16. He was a fan of her father's writing and became a close friend of the family. Her father had a lot of trouble with debt and was hoping that Shelley would be able to give him money to pay off his debts. However, Shelley wasn't on good terms with his own family, and didn't actually have access to as much money as he'd let them believe. Percy and Mary often went for walks, and one of Mary's stepsisters was a chaperone. However, there are reports that say the sister was left behind to sit somewhere while Mary and Percy went off for some privacy. I've lost my point. There you go. It was around this time that Mary lost her virginity to Percy, and most stories claim that it was on top of her mother's grave. However, despite the friendship between her father and Percy Shelley, their relationship was frowned upon because Percy was already married and his estranged wife was pregnant. One of Godwin's main beliefs was that marriage was a repressive monopoly, and many of his friends had run off with married lovers, or married friends had run off with their unmarried lovers. However, Godwin did his best to separate the couple and to save his daughter's reputation. Mary and Percy eloped to France in July of 1814 along with Mary's stepsister Claire. But they left Percy's wife behind. When they returned to England only a few months later, they found Mary's family wanted nothing to do with them. On top of this, they also discovered that Mary was pregnant. Her pregnancy was difficult. She was often ill, and Percy was constantly having to leave their home to try and avoid debtors. Add to this the fact that his wife gave birth to a son, and he was very openly overjoyed at this. He was often on outings with her sister Claire, and Percy was an avid believer of Godwin's ideas of free love and open relationships, so it's kind of agreed on that he'd already seduced Claire and they were lovers. Mary, however, struggled with jealousy because of this. She agreed with her father's beliefs in general, but when it came to Percy, she only loved him and she only wanted him. He even suggested at one point that she should become lovers with one of his friends, and while she liked the friend, he was her friend as well, and they flirted, she was never interested in anything more. Her daughter was born prematurely, February 1815. They didn't name her because she wasn't expected to survive, and in fact, in March, Mary woke one night to feed the baby, but found that she couldn't wake her. Mary believed that the baby was just sleeping sound, and went back to bed. In the morning, they discovered the baby was actually dead, and had already been dead when Mary woke earlier in the night. The diagnosis was that it died of convulsions. Over the years, Mary would have 4 children altogether, plus 1 miscarriage, but only one of these kids actually survived till adulthood. That's better. The idea for Frankenstein was born on a holiday in Geneva, where she and Percy were visiting with Claire, Lord Byron and others. Byron, yeah, that Lord Byron, suggested they each write a ghost story. Mary struggled for days to find inspiration, constantly being asked every morning, have you got a story yet? Have you thought of something? And being ashamed that she was always answering, not yet, no. However, one night they sat up late discussing life and science and all of this, and Mary had the idea of a corpse being revived with electricity. Galvanism, the animating of bodies with electricity, was a new science at the time, and is of course, nowadays we know it's possible. It's the origin of modern day defibrillators. At the time, they hadn't succeeded in reviving bodies yet, but they had discovered that if you applied electrical charges to dead tissue, it would move. Literally, this is disgusting, they would take a dead body, they'd cut it open, and then they'd put a piece of metal in, run an electrical charge through to demonstrate that when you did that, the hand would move. And they did this for public demonstrations. You could pay for a ticket to go in and watch. They sat up late, and eventually they retired to bed. Mary struggled to sleep and found herself having what she described as a waking dream. She saw a pale man kneeling beside his creation, a body sewn from many parts, and as she watched, the body began to twitch and move with the application of electricity. When she finally published the novel, she did so anonymously. As a result, it was believed by many at the time to have been written by Percy Shelley, because his name was he wrote the foreword for it, and his was the only name attached to it. Percy did collaborate on the novel, but it's been proved since to have been in the form of advice on structure, grammar, less of a collaborator, more of a line editor. The couple were actually married in 1816 after Percy's wife committed suicide, and after many years of writing, travelling, Percy Shelley was killed in a boating accident off the coast of Italy. He was cremated, but his heart refused to burn. The scientists believe it was due to the organ having been calcified, so turned to calcium, turned to stone, due to tuberculosis. It was collected after the cremation by a friend of Shelley's, and eventually they returned it to Mary. However, Mary didn't bury it with the rest of his remains. Instead, she wrapped it in silk and a page of one of his poems, Adonis, and she carried it with her for many years. After her death, it was discovered in her desk by her son. It was eventually buried with him when he died in later years. Following her husband's death, she may have had romantic relationships with women. She definitely had feelings for them, and admitted in a letter to a friend, "I was so ready to give myself away, and being afraid of men, I was apt to get towsy-mousy for women." Now, Tuzzy Muzzy had been slang for vagina since the 1600s, so we can deduct from that that towsy-mousy was some form of slang for sexual attraction. And there are also some stories that claim she may have had a relationship with Jane Williams shortly after her husband's death. It doesn't come as much of a surprise because she really was a strong supporter of other members of the LGBTQ plus community. She helped two female friends escape to Paris. They needed fake passports so they could live as husband and wife, and Mary was able to help them procure these. Her later years were spent travelling with her son. Over these years, she was targeted by 3 different blackmailers. One, a political exile from Italy that she'd met in Paris, threatened to publish letters from Mary to him from Mary if she didn't pay him. Her son's friend, however, bribed a police officer to seize the man's papers, including the letters, and they were all destroyed. Mary herself ended up buying some letters written from her and her husband from a man who claimed to be Lord Byron's illegitimate son. And finally, one of her husband's cousins threatened to publish a damaging biography of Percy Shelley unless she paid him. Good for Mary, she refused. She died after a long illness. She'd been suffering from headaches and bouts of paralysis, and she passed away in 1851, aged 53, and it was believed to have been from a brain tumour. So, there you go. A Gothic icon who defied the social norms of the time and is responsible for creating an entire literary genre. It wasn't my intention for the first 4 of these women to all be members of the LGBT community. I didn't even know about Mary Shelley being bisexual until I began researching for this video. And I did a character study of her for college when I trained her in one of my assessments. So clearly I did not do enough reading for that. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. All the sources are down below. Love you lots, and I'll see you next week. Mwah!